problem because it's 12 degrees centigrade.
Anyway, people are still joining, so we will give it a few more minutes before we get started.
Sure. Yes, sure. Sure. In today's session, here with me, my long-standing friend and colleague, Maruf Hussain, will assist us. Since I have some shortcomings in handling technical things. Oh, Professor Rajat Dev is here. Namaskar, sir. Professor Rajat Dev, you can unmute so that we can hear you. We can't hear you, sir. Please unmute that.
Now I am unmuted.
Yes, yes. Sir, namaskar. How are you, sir?
Namaskar.
Last session was really, it was really a thought-provoking session, and
You're most kind. Glad you enjoyed it.
Yes, we all enjoyed it, sir. Sir, we are 9:05. So, can we start now, Professor Patnaik, sir?
Yes, if you like, we can start.
Yes, I would like to start now because otherwise our time management will be. Let me. Namaskar, Assalamu alaikum, good evening, and warm greetings to everyone. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to Session 8 of the International Study Circle on Individual Well-being and Social Welfare. On behalf of the Banglar Pathshala Foundation and our esteemed convener, Professor Prashanto Patnaik, I express my heartfelt gratitude for your continued presence, dedication, and generosity of spirit throughout this journey of shared learning. Each session in this study circle has allowed us to collectively deepen our understanding of how individual well-being and social welfare intersect, diverge, and evolve through different philosophical, economic, and ethical lenses. Today, we are specially honored to continue this tradition with a topic of profound significance, that is measuring poverty in a multidimensional framework. It is my pleasure to introduce and it is my privilege to introduce our distinguished speaker of this evening, Professor Shatakshee Dhongde from Ivan Allen College of Liberal Arts at the Georgia Institute of Technology, USA. Dr. Shatakshee Dhongde is a professor of economics at Georgia Tech. She obtained her PhD from University of California, Riverside. Her research has focused on poverty, inequality, and deprivation. She was one of the first scholars to provide consistent estimates of multidimensional poverty in the US to date. To date, she has published more than 20 referred journal articles and book chapters and has presented her research at several national and international forums, including the World Bank and the United Nations. Dr. Dhongde is the recipient of Dean George C. Griffin Faculty of the Year Award 2022, Mary S. and Richard B. Inman Jr. Faculty Excellent Award in 2021, and Evan Allen Jr. Legacy Award in 2019. She is President-elect of the International Association for Review of Income and Wealth, a Fellow of the Society of Economic Measurement, and a research affiliate with the Institute of Research on Poverty at the University of Wisconsin, Madison. Her work has featured in media, including the BBC and the NPR. Since 2021, she serves as the Associate Dean of Academic Affairs at the Evan Allen College of Liberal Arts at Georgia Tech. Professor Dhongde is widely respected for her pioneering contributions to poverty measurement, inequality analysis, and applied welfare economics. Her work has helped reshape how scholars and policymakers conceptualize deprivation, moving beyond income alone to consider education, health, living standard, vulnerabilities, and the many interlinked dimensions that define human well-being. Her scholarship has been central to strengthening the global conversation around multidimensional poverty measurement. By integrating rigorous empirical analysis with a deep normative understanding, she has illuminated the ways in which poverty is complex, layered, and often hidden beneath aggregate statistics. Her work continues to inspire academics, professionals, and international institutions committed to designing more humane, inclusive, and effective development policies. In light of these, today's session holds special relevance for all of us as we engage with questions of well-being, justice, and social welfare. A multidimensional perspective on poverty becomes not just useful, but essential. It helps us recognize the lived experiences of deprivation, understand the structural causes that perpetuate them, and explore more holistic responses rooted in equity and human dignity. We are deeply grateful to Professor Dhongde for accepting our invitation and for her willingness to share her insights with our community. I want to acknowledge the contributions of friends who helped gather the reading materials, particularly Mr. Altaf Hussain Russell of University of Glasgow, whose support ensured that participants could engage more meaningfully with today's discussion. Before we begin, I extend my warmest appreciation to each participant joining from Bangladesh, South Asia, and around the world. Your thoughtful engagement, questions, and reflections are what makes this study circle a living intellectual space, one that honors curiosity, compassion, and the pursuit of a better world. With these words, It is my privilege to invite Professor Shatakshee Dhongde to begin her talk. Professor, we are truly honored to have you with us.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction, Dr. Chaudhary. Appreciate that passages about the impact. I don't know how much impact I have done on poverty measurement, but it is a topic of much passion, and I've pursued it during my academic career. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to join this and present my work in the study circle. Appreciate you giving me this opportunity. I know this is a global forum, and definitely we have scholars from across the world, including South Asia and Bangladesh in particular. I want to thank my advisor, colleague, and co-author now, Dr. Prashant Patnaik, for conducting this study circle and inviting me to present in here. It's always a great honor to have him in the audience, and that also starts me worrying that there will be a question coming from him at the end, which we need to be prepared to answer. Thanks, Dr. Morris Salas, for joining us today, and other dignitaries in the audience. I really appreciate your time, and I hope you find this small talk useful. I will be happy to take any clarifying questions if you have. I suppose those can be put in the chat, and then the coordinator will let me know if there are during the lecture. And I was told that I'll talk for about an hour or so, and then we'll stop and take the longer questions. So if you have longer discussion questions, we can take them at the end. I'm going to start sharing my slides, and do let me know if you're not able to see or hear me. I will try to speak up, so just let me know if the volume is not good. Hmm. All right. I hope everyone is able to see the slides, and then I can move on.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. And let me know again if the audio keeps going down, and I'll try to speak up a bit more. Good morning, everyone. Good morning from Atlanta. I know you all are in different time zones, and especially folks in Bangladesh are trying to stay awake, so I won't bore you too long. I hope you find the topic interesting. It has been something of great interest to me, starting right from my dissertation work with Dr. Patnaik, which is looking at poverty measurement. And today I'm going to focus on multidimensional poverty measurement. And what have been some of the recent developments in that field. To give you sort of a brief overview of our talk today, I'm going to touch base, of course, not going to too much details, but at least touch base on some of these points, looking at limitations of some of the traditional income poverty measures and the need for a multidimensional approach. We can talk about SAIN's capability approach for a few minutes, and then really move into the multidimensional poverty indices. I'm going to focus here mostly on the framework which has been widely used, the Alkire-Foster Index, but then, of course, talk about some of the alternative indices which have been proposed. And at the end of the talk, I thought it would be useful to give you an illustration, an empirical illustration to show what is the use of these measures and how they can inform policymakers and give some better insights when we are looking at how to measure quality of life for the population. My work has largely been focused in the US, so I'm going to pull from my work on empirical illustration in the US, but I do hope that you'll find the insights useful in other contexts where you are looking at other countries and data from those respective countries. So let me quickly go over the different aspects of a traditional income poverty measure, or let me just say a unidimensional poverty measure, which is using a single dimension. Typically, you're looking at quantitative or qualitative measures. We have scholars working on subjective measures. If you remember, there was a World Bank report led by Dr. Ravi Kanpur. It was looking at voices of the poor, and that was mainly looking at subjective poverty. And there are a lot of different ways in which, even if you ask qualitative data, do you think you're poor? There are precise ways to measure those responses and talk about poverty in that fashion. Most of the national statistics which countries use are using the objective poverty measures, and those are typically based on a nutritional threshold. For India, it may be a 3,500 calorie specific threshold. For the World Bank, it can be a $1 purchasing power parity dollars or $2. So the threshold is going to be much more objective than the previous subjective measures. These measures can be divided. Then, if we look at the objective measures, we can sort of look at them at relative poverty measures or the absolute poverty measures. Martin Ravelin has a great book looking at all these aspects on poverty measurement and goes into details into each one of these. But relative measures, you can think of those coming from the EU nations typically, where you are putting a poverty line of 50% or less of, say, your median income. So as incomes increase, poverty thresholds will increase accordingly, and you will sort of adjust the poverty thresholds to the income distribution. The absolute thresholds are different. Those, as I said, can be based on a purchasing power or a basket of commodities. Those can be based on nutritional intake, and those are going to be absolute in the sense that even if income distribution moves, you may end up with a much larger or much lower absolute poverty. Ravelin used to joke that you can sort of eliminate absolute poverty, but not the relative poverty, because it's going to be tied to your income levels when you're looking at some percentages of your median incomes. Lastly, when you're looking at these unidimensional measures, you would see that they are based on national surveys. Surveys are either done at a household level or at an individual level. If they are done at an household level, there is a big literature looking at equivalence scale and how do we allocate within household resources and capture distribution within an household. But broadly, surveys, if you look at different countries, would be done on consumption or consumption basket. And many of the poverty lines are based on consumption specific expenses. You will have food versus non-food consumption catered into that. For example, the US poverty measure is based on consumption and has 1/3 of the expense allocated to non-food and 2/3 to the food component in it. We also have some countries doing the income surveys. Most of these are either middle or high income countries which are looking at income surveys. Most of the lower income countries will be doing at consumption surveys. And then very few of the poverty measures will be looking at other aspects such as wealth or assets. But of course, there is uh, good literature. Tony Sharrock has a paper on why we should focus on asset poverty or wealth poverty rather than something as a flow variable as consumption and income. What I have given you below is the literature for the US, looking at all of these different poverty measures, just to give you a flavor that people do often refer to these and measure poverty in a different fashion. When we are looking at any of these single dimensional poverty measures, we do realize that they have limitations. And I guess I'm preaching here at the choir, so I'm going to move a bit fast on this. That we know that the standard of living cannot be really captured with a single indicator, be it the consumption or consumption basket or income of a household. And the literature really goes back to the philosophical framework by Sain. But even before Sain, if you think of Townsend's work, there was this thought that we need to have a more comprehensive way to capture standard of living. And SAIN really brought into the discussion a person's or an individual's capability to function in a society. So capability is going to tell you what are the ways in which a person can achieve some minimal functionings. Income may not be the functioning you're looking at, but it may be one of the ways to achieve these functionings. So when we are looking at income poverty, you're sort of looking at it in an indirect way rather than a lack of capability. We are looking at it in terms of what is the most easiest indicator to capture those capabilities. A lot of literature on this approach, a lot of philosophical essays coming out on this, as well as more applied work coming out of this framework. And I'm going to sort of give you a flavor of the applied work, that the capability approach was sort of the basis for United Nations Human Development Index. If you recall, the index is looking at well-being rather than poverty, and it's based on multiple dimensions. It was introduced in 1990 by Mehboob ul Haq, who led the Human Development Reports, the first one, which was published after that and is still published annually. So it's been very consistent in measuring standard of living of the population across different countries. It looks into three broad dimensions, and those will be looking at health, and you're looking at life expectancy at birth. You're looking at education in terms of years of schooling, and then standard of living. They do include an income measure, which is the gross national income per capita for countries. The index was later on changed from a simple arithmetic mean. You have a bit more of a weighting scheme there, and the geometric mean is now sort of applied after you have all the normalized gaps between each of these dimensions. This being a well-being index and consistently being published, the UN also started looking at poverty index, and the closest that we come to something previous to the multidimensional index was the human poverty index, and this was published sort of for about between 1997 and 2009. They stopped publishing this once they introduced the multidimensional poverty index. It also looked at similar dimensions on health, education, and standard of living. And they did include different ways to capture human or poverty across developing and developed countries. So the indicators are slightly different for the two sets of countries. One part I did want to mention here, and that's at the bottom of the slide, is that both of these measures are using what we call as a column first approach. And that means you're looking at data for each dimension. You're looking for, say, life expectancy from a particular data source. Then you're looking at education, which may come from a different data source. What is the average years of education in a particular country? The GNI, of course, will come from the statistical offices. And looking at each one of these in aggregate, the data is giving you an average life expectancy, average years of schooling, and GNI. You have some ways to aggregate this, and that's why we call it column first, because you're approaching each of the dimensions first and then aggregating them across the dimensions. The innovation which happened in the capability approach was, instead of doing the column first approach, we started looking at the row first approach. And we are going to talk a bit about this because we are going to focus on the row first approach than the column first approach. But just keep in mind that this is going to be much more data intense. And of course, that means that the indicators that you're going to choose for these type of measures are going to be limited depending on what's contained in the survey. So even if we may believe that there would be other ways to capture standard of living and deprivation, many of these indicators are constrained by the availability of information in some of the surveys that they are using. After the Human Poverty Index, the UN started or switched or stopped estimating the Human Poverty Index and started looking at the Multidimensional Poverty Index. The first estimate was published in the 2010 Human Development Report. And they have used mostly the Alkire-Foster measures, which were later on published in the Journal of Public Econ in 2011 paper. And they have expanded, the authors have expanded on these measures. They have the Oxford Poverty Health initiative, which has a lot of a big series on looking at different properties of these indices. If you look at the current statistics, 2025 Human Development Report, it publishes multidimensional poverty estimates for about 109 developing countries. So that's a big effort that the UN is putting into these measures. They are estimating about 17.5% of the global population, what they have in those countries to be multidimensional poor. That's about a billion out of the 6 billion in household informations or individual informations that they have. More recently, the World Bank has also started publishing the World Bank's multidimensional poverty measure. So MPI versus MPM is how they are distinguishing it. They started estimating or publishing those results starting 2018. And right now they have slightly higher number of countries, 113 economies, where they have these what we call as harmonized surveys done. Their estimates also look very similar. Global estimates about 17% are multidimensional poor. They also talk about income poor, about 11% if you're looking at a $3 per day poverty threshold. So both the measures are approximately looking at different indicators, and I'll talk about those, but identifying about the same incidence of multidimensional poor. When I mentioned that the row first approach is what is needed for these poverty measures, what you're looking at is survey data, which is micro level on all dimensions. So you cannot really approach one dimension, get data on that and go to the next. You are following an individual or you're following a household and you want to have 5 dimensions included in your measure. The household needs to have responded to all those 5 questions on those particular dimensions or particular indicators. If we look at the UN MPI, they look at responses from household as well as individuals. So you will see that the questions are either meant at household level or individual level. They're looking at health, education, and standard of living. When I'm talking about dimensions, and I'll go to the next slide to let you know the differences between them, we are talking something of more of an umbrella or an overarching word here when I'm talking about health, but how do we measure multidimensional deprivation in health? What are the indicators we use? Those are the parts where we use the term indicator. So the dimensions are much broader. The indicators are going to be something for each of these dimensions. The World Bank measure is looking almost similar dimensions, though one distinction is it is also looking at the monetary poverty levels. It includes some indicators on education as well as on basic infrastructure. Apologies that the slide may not be very legible here, but feel free to ask me and I'll be able to send you the links for those. If you look at the UN MPI and the dimensions, that's the first column. You're looking at health, education, and standard of living. In health, as we just said, you'll have 2 different indicators, nutrition as well as child mortality. They are looking at nutrition for any person under 70 years, where they have information on whether the person is undernourished or not. Child mortality, as you know, children under 18 who do not survive the first 5 years. We look at years of schooling, and we have household member who does not have 6 years of schooling, and school attendance is again now looking more specifically at school-aged children. We have living standards and longer list there. I won't go into the details of that, but you'll look at cooking fuel, whether the household has access to drinking water, sanitation facilities, electricity, housing, and so on. Take a look at the weights. Those are what we call as nested weights. that all the dimensions are given equal weights. So the weights, we have three dimensions. Each dimension will be carrying 1/3 weight. And then within the dimension, each indicator is having some weight allocated. Here they're allocating equal weights. It doesn't have to be, but typically you will start with equal weights. And if you have two indicators in health, then each one is getting 1/6 of the weight. So that's how they are looking at the multidimensional poverty index across countries. Note that when I mentioned the UN MPI, these are the indicators which will be applicable mostly for developing countries. Dr. Salas had his hand raised, maybe? Uh, I guess you may want to unmute yourself. I didn't get the question.
No question. Sorry, I just want to
Okay,
have
okay,
some
sorry,
light.
sorry. I thought you had a hand raised. Sorry about that. Okay, we're looking at the World Bank Multidimensional Poverty Index. This is looking slightly different at the top because they are including monetary poverty measure, looking at the daily consumption expenditure, depending on the country, or income expenditure, which is less than $2. That's their extreme poverty measure now. You're looking at education, similar index to what the UN has, similar way in which the weights are getting allocated, right? 1/3 for each one of those dimensions. And then we are looking at access to basic infrastructure. They have fewer indicators here than the UN measure, but very similar in terms of drinking water, sanitation, and electricity. One of the big constraints that we faced when we decided to adopt some of these measures to the US were that the indicators are not really capturing the standard of living in a developed country. And looking at access for sanitation, for instance, access to electricity, those are much more suitable in a different setting. And you do want to change the indicators depending on if you are trying to develop a measure for the US. So what we did was we looked more into the EU Silk data, which is a very comprehensive data set used by EU nations, and tried to see some of the indicators in used in those measures, as well as looked at the Stiglitz-Fitosi et al. Report, which looks at some basic dimensions for developed countries, and we've tried to build our measure around those. So moved away from the UN or the World Bank measures when we started looking at the US poverty measurement. Moving on to the third component, just to keep the flow of the discussion, I would talk a bit about the traditional or most widely used measure because it's most widely used in empirical studies, the Alkire-Foster measure. And then I'll talk a few slides on the alternatives which are proposed in the literature, and then sort of give you a flavor of multidimensional poverty measure in the US. We are sort of at the half mark, so this is good. We are going at a good pace here. When we are looking at approaches, and this is really an overview, I've tried to include as many studies. I'm sure there are many more, but just to give you a flavor of what the literature looks like when you're looking at how to measure multidimensional poverty, what are the different indices, the majority of the literature falls under the axiomatic approach, and you have a lot many people starting way back almost 2 or more decades of literature here, and that has been a prevalent way in which people are proposing different indices which satisfy different properties. There is a subset within the axiomatic framework, and that is something worth mentioning because the Alkire-Foster indices fall in this category, which is looking more at the counting approach, where you are counting the number of deprivations. And we have, of course, other measures into this counting approach. I'm going to talk a bit about an alternative measure that we proposed in our paper using the axiomatic framework, and which is related but slightly different from the Alkire-Foster measure. Other literature is also rich. You have information theory used by my colleague here in Atlanta, S.C. Masumi. He has done a lot of work there. I've cited one of his papers. You have people using statistical techniques like principal component analysis, fuzzy sets to measure different thresholds for these dimensions. You also have a latent variable approach, which is typically used in other literature, say labor and labor productivity, that they have tried to use that approach. Jack Silver, another of my good colleague, has an interesting paper on those. So there are a lot more approaches to that, but I've given you a highlights of some of the basic ones. We are going to look at the Alkire-Foster measure a bit more closely. As I mentioned, both the UN's measure as well as the World Bank measure uses this index when they are estimating multidimensional poverty. So most of the countries will have estimates based on this index. So it's a good idea for us to take a closer look at this. On the left-hand column, I've given you the general notation. I'll walk you through that, but sometimes it's much easier in the presentation where I'm giving you an illustration. So the example is on the right-hand column. For any multidimensional poverty measure, you do want a matrix which consists of either individuals or, as we mentioned, depending on the information, it can be households. And that is going to be your N part of the matrix, or the number of rows that you have in the matrix. That's the row first approach, that you do want to look at what is the information available for each individual or each household. And you have then the indicators. I'm going to move away from the dimensions right now because a cluster of indicators will be combined as a dimension. So it's much easier to talk in terms of indicators where you're looking at specific ways in which we are capturing deprivation in each one of those. Of course, you have weights allocated. I'm going to keep right now the discussion simple with equal weights. And I've just given 1 over D for each one of those. As we said in the previous UN MPI, that the weights were nested, so not all indicators had the same weights. It depended on how many indicators were included in each one of those dimensions. So suppose we have 5 individuals. Let's take an example. And they are we have information on those 5 individuals on 4 different indicators. And they have, each one of them, we assign an equal weight of 1 over 4. What do we have? What we have is what we call as the achievement matrix. So this matrix is giving, as I mentioned, the rows are the individuals and the columns are going to be your, the individuals and columns are the indicators. So I have 5 individuals, 4 indicators, a 5 by 4 matrix. You're having achievement of individual I in each indicator J. Now, I did not specify right now whether we have cardinal data, ordinal data, binary data, right? So I'm keeping that open and we can talk about that a bit more into details, but the framework is more general, that it can include both cardinal as well as ordinal or a 0-1 binary variable into this example. Once we have the achievements of these individuals plotted, you want to have a threshold for each of the indicators. So imagine that your first indicator is on life expectancy, or what is another measure was looking at number of years of schooling. You want to have a threshold. The threshold can be for years of schooling. Do you have 12 years of schooling? Are you a high school graduate or not? Do you have a college degree or not? The thresholds will depend on what country you're looking at. Another indicator may be just a 1-0. Do you have access to electricity? And the threshold will be yes. And how many individuals have access to electricity versus no. So the thresholds will be specific to those indicators. If for the World Bank's one, if you remember, they have the income as an indicator. Their threshold there was $2 per day in terms of the PPP poverty line. The Alkire-Foster measure uses what we call as the dual identification of the poor. So there are 2 steps involved in this. The first step is going to be, you're going to use the thresholds as we were just discussing for each of these indicators and identifying the deprivation for each individual in that indicator. So you have to identify deprivation for a particular individual and a particular indicator. That's the first step. Once you have that, then you are going to aggregate, and that's where the counting approach comes into picture. You are going to count the number of deprivations for each individual, and you are going to then say, should I call individuals deprived with three deprivations, four deprivations, one deprivation as multidimensional poor? So there are two steps involved into this. We can look at our example, going from the achievement matrix, which will have very different values. You want to sort of put it all together and put them as 1 and 0s. So note that there is a bit of loss of information here. I'm not looking at the actual number of years of schooling, but I'm putting a threshold saying, do you have high school education or not? And then I'm putting, if you have high school education or more, you are having an achievement in that indicator, the value will be 1. If not, the value will be 0. So now we are sort of distilling all of that information and putting the achievement matrix or converting it into a deprivation matrix, and that's going to be a 1-0 deprivation matrix. The way I'm reading this matrix right now is that individual 1 has 2 deprivations in indicator 1 and 2. Individual 3 will have 4 deprivations, and so on. So we are just basically counting the number of deprivations that are involved for each individual. So the last one, which is a column matrix, is giving you the sum of deprivations for each individual. And we have 5 individuals. I'm adding the deprivations for each one of them, and I'm getting what is the sum for each one of those. Looking at our notations, if I'm looking at the deprivation index, let's call that as G, and that is converting, if you look at the achievement matrix, it's just converting if the achievement is below the threshold, converting it into 1, otherwise 0. And the C0 is your column matrix, which is giving you the sum of individuals' deprivation scores. Moving forward, now you want to look at that second step, right? You have the Z part, the first step of identifying deprivation in each indicator using the thresholds for each indicator is done. Now you are looking at the scores of deprivations and looking at what we call as a truncated deprivation column. So this was the larger one, was our deprivation matrix, 1s and 0s. I added all of the deprivation scores for each of the individuals, and I went to C0. That was my column vector of all the sums. And now I'm going to make that as a function of k. And what is that k telling me? I can choose the k in whichever way I want. I'm here in the example choosing k equals 2. So that means I'm putting the second threshold or that second step right now, saying that if you have 2 or more deprivations, I'm going to identify you as multidimensional poor. And if that is the case, I'll keep the scores for individuals 1, 2, 3, and 5, but I'm going to move the score for individual 4 as 0. So the difference between this C0 and C0 as a function of k is where I'm taking away the individual 1 from that column vector, saying that he or she had only 1 deprivation, and our qualification is if you have 2 or more deprivations. So sort of that's the second step, or that's the second cutoff we are implementing, where we are having how many deprivations. Typically, the UN MPI is looking at 30%. Or more as number of deprivations. The World Bank is having something similar. And most of the empirical literature will be keeping somewhere between 30 to 40%. I'm going to focus a bit more here on the K part and talk to you about 3 broad categories in which we can look at this second identification step is choosing the number of indicators in which you are deprived and then classifying you as multidimensional poor. So the first step is done in terms of moving from the achievement matrix to the deprivation matrix. But once I have that sum of deprivations, how many people should I count as multidimensional poor? The first one is called the union approach, where I'm putting k's value equal to 1. So if you are deprived in any one indicator, you are going to be termed as poor, which means in some way you're treating these indicators, I'm using the word indicators, dimensions here slightly loosely and calling them dimensions in the same way as indicators, that they are perfect complements of each other, right? Which means that if you are deprived in any one of those, you're not able to attain that standard of living. Your measure is saying that you are deprived, you are not able to enjoy the other achievements, even if you are deprived in a single one. And these measures, if you look at national statistics, will tend to overestimate because it's going to keep the bar pretty high that everyone should have achievements in all dimensions if they are going to be classified as non-poor. The opposite end of the spectrum is where I'm putting k equals d is the number of all the indicators that we have, which is going to say that a person is identified as multidimensional poor only if they are deprived in all the indicators that we have. So if I had 5 indicators, I would go back into my example and say that we had individual 3 as deprived by the intersection approach because he or she was deprived in each one of these and none of the other individuals were deprived. So that's sort of the other extreme. In some ways, you can think that these dimensions are perfect, are treated now as perfect substitutes. So as long as if you are deprived in one and not the other, then you're not going to be classified here as multidimensionally poor. And that's going to, if you look again at empirical data, sort of underestimate your poverty measures because now the bar is pretty low. You would capture only a very minute or tiny fraction of the population, which will be deprived in all. And I'll show you some empirical examples from the US looking at both of these approaches. The counting approach by Alcaire Foster is letting you decide. You can choose any of the statistical methods, or you can just put it as a normative case, saying we want to have minimum number of k numbers. The k should be between now 1 and d. That range should be that if I have 5 indicators, k can take the value anywhere between 1 and 5. And that's going to help you determine how many. Typically, people in developed countries have done any 2 as their thresholds, just taking the world literally as multidimensional. So if you want multiple indicator deprivations, you're just going to use something where you have more than one deprivation. All right, once we have this, what we call as C naught as a function of K or a censored score for the deprivations for each individuals, we want to aggregate or add all of these deprivations. And how are we going to do that? We want to add and then take some kind of an average, right? That's the idea when we want to have an index. And how are we looking at this average is we are going to take the sum of all of these deprivation scores. So here I'm taking for all individuals, what is their score, CI, depending on K. Remember, I do not have that 4th individual because in that second step, that individual did not qualify as multidimensional poor. So we are removing that individual and then looking at the scores for all of the others in that set or that subset. And we add all of those in this illustrative example that will give me the number 11. So that's your total deprivation in the society for those who you have identified as poor. And that is expressed as a proportion of the total possible deprivations in the society. Again, a simplified way here is the weights are 1 over d. If you want different weights, the weights will come inside as w, and then you're going to divide it by just 1 over n. So I'm just using a simple example here where weights are equal to 1 over d for each indicator. So if I look at that product of n and d, that is actually my matrix, right? That's my matrix dimensions, number of individuals time all the indicators. So all possible societal deprivations were 20 in our example, and the population was having 11. So we are having 11 over 20 as our adjusted head count ratio. So that's the basic head count ratio which Alcaire Foster have proposed, and that's the indicator or index that has been used by the UN and the World Bank. So this adjusted head count ratio M naught is giving you this total deprivations prevalent about as a proportion of the maximum possible deprivations in the society. They do talk about some of the components of this one. And believe me, this has some attractive properties, and that's why people are using this much more widely. The interesting property is that M naught can be expressed as a product of two different indicators. One is a simple head count. How many individuals did I count as multidimensionally poor using those two thresholds? I had 1, 2, 3, 4 individuals in this example out of 5 individuals. So I identified 4 out of 5 as the multidimensional poor. So this is just giving me the incidence of multidimensional poverty in the society. The second one is interesting. It looks very much like M naught, that it's adding the scores of all the multidimensional poor. It's adding the scores, it's taking 11 as the numerator, but instead of dividing it by n times d, now I'm dividing it by q times d. And q is the number of multidimensional poor that I had identified. So now I'm expressing the deprivation prevalent in the society as a proportion of the deprivation possible among all the multidimensional poor. So instead of 5, I'm going to have 4 times 4 or 16 as my numerator. And then I'm going to take 11 over 16. Remember, we are already accounting for that q here. It's q over n times 1 over q over d times this. So if I take a product of these, the q's are going to get cancelled, and I'm ending up with an M naught measure, which is 1 over nd times the score, the total score of that censored matrix. The useful part for many of the empirical researchers is that this is a useful way to capture the intensity, which is captured by the A part or the average intensity, versus the incidence of poverty. And you can then track M naught over time between these two indices. Thinking about more on the empirical side, what are the different choices you have to make when you're using the Alkire-Foster index is you have to, of course, use the threshold or choose a threshold for each of the indicators. You have the literature to guide you over there. You may choose some other ways to decide the thresholds, but this is sort of a problem which any poverty measure will face, right? Even if we have a unidimensional one, what should be the income level? And we have a huge debate in the US looking at the official poverty measure versus the supplemental poverty measure. Just for incomes, what should be the threshold? So that is something which we have to choose. Once we have that, the second threshold, as I said, since it's a counting approach, it's asking you how many of those should qualify you to fall in that group of multidimensional poor. Is it 2 out of 5? Is it 3 out of 5? Is it the union approach? All 5 out of 5 or 1 out of 5, depending on which approach you want to take. And then, of course, you have to decide whether you want to have equal weights. You want to have, as we saw in the UN measure, nested weights. We have a paper, Dr. Patnaik, myself, and Dr. Shu, who was also part of this study circle presentation, looking at hierarchical weights, where you're sort of looking at some kind of lexicographic ordering. And you're saying, well, let's put weights on basic attributes, and you have to have achievement or deprivation in the basic attribute, and then you have a second class, which is the non-basic attribute. So you can have different ways in which these weights are getting assigned. Moving on, just keeping track where we are. Moving on, some of the advantages of the MPI or the Alkire-Foster adjusted head count ratio is that it is much clear framework, pretty simple in the sense of it's intuitive. It can be generalized. I showed you just M naught, which is the index which is used in empirical studies, but they do have generalization. This is the adjusted head count ratio, the FGT measure of head count ratio of income poverty versus the squared poverty measure and the average gap. You can have similar generalizations of the Alkire measure looking at the FGT measure. So there is sort of a nice parallel there for people to visualize in terms of income poverty or single dimensional poverty, how it can be generalized in the multidimensional framework. You can use cardinal as well as ordinal data, and that is very helpful for empirical studies because not always do we have cardinal data. Much of the literature before the Alkire-Foster index was based on indices assuming data was cardinal. And here, since we are converting the achievements into 1 and 0, though there is a loss of information, it's also allowing you to use ordinal data, that you have ordered ones. People are telling you you can have people scoring themselves as something as satisfied, very satisfied, not satisfied, and you can have that type of data included in this measure. The measures do focus on some of the axioms, and I will go in the next slide into some other axioms, but poverty focus in the sense that if you have change in the achievement level of a non-poor individual, the index should not change. Similarly, a deprivation focus should be if there is an increase in any non-deprived achievement, that index should not change for that particular individual. And I guess people are familiar with some of these axiomatic properties. Just to tell you about the Alkire-Foster adjusted headcount index, it has some nice properties when you are applying it or trying to use empirical studies, that you can divide it by subgroups. Or you can divide it by dimensions. The dimension decomposition is something which is interesting. You can assign what part of it, the total deprivation, came out of health versus education versus standard of living. You can look at, in the US, it would be or by race, or other countries, it may be by caste or religion if you are looking at subgroup decomposition. They're also consistent by subgroups or have the dimensional monotonicity. So some interesting properties there. Some of the drawbacks in the sense that people have looked at that intermediate approach. It's really something that they embrace, and other studies want to move away from that approach. Instead of having that K being flexible anywhere between 1 and D, people have preferred either using a union approach or looking at other ways in which they can decide. For an individual, if you're looking who's poor in one or more dimensions, we are not looking really at how they are faring in other dimensions, right? So there is that loss of information when I'm looking at this intermediate approach. I'm going to talk for a few minutes and then really go into the empirical application. But a few minutes about alternative indices, and I'm going to borrow one on which is most familiar because we have worked on that when I know we have Dr. Patnaik in the audience, so any questions on this, I'm going to let him take those. But just to give you an introduction, right, about alternative ways in which we can modify the Alkire-Foster index, that instead of intermediate approach, suppose we go with the union approach, right? So you're counting individuals who are deprived in at least one. Just remember that K is going to be equal to 1, that any one deprivation will qualify you as multidimensional poor. What does this alternative approach take into account is the distribution, right? It's going to take in some way the overlap. It's going to look at how the achievements are distributed. So it's going to assign slightly different weight. It's not going to be a linear transformation, but you can use a much broader way or a much generalized way. We show you in our example in the paper a power function, and I can show you that quickly. So what they're proposing is a framework where in fact the Alkire-Foster index becomes a special case of the more generalized index. And that's why I chose this example, since I've walked you through that Alkire-Foster index, that you have what we call as the nominal deprivation. So think of that G0 matrix that we saw earlier on. It's very similar to what Alkire-Foster used as 1 and 0. So it's also moving from achievements into deprivations for each of those individuals. And then adding those, I have shown the sum over the weight. So each of the indicators is getting 1/4 as the weight, and then we are getting the score. Note that I have kept now that fourth individual because it's a union approach. Even if you're deprived in any one dimension, you are going to be treated as deprived. Once we have the scores, then what we are going to say is we are going to move away from that nominal deprivation matrix to something called a real deprivation matrix. And what is that going to look like? You're going to use a transformation function on that C. So remember, for Alkire-Foster, this C was just summation of this C part. Now, instead of taking C as it is, you're going to transform that C by using any increasing and convex function on those deprivations. In the example, I've used a par function and I've used G square. So what I'm looking at is, once I have these added scores, I'm going to take the square of each one of these. Once I do that, you do note that the weights are now assigned separately. Right now, I'm looking at the distribution sensitivity of the deprivations rather than treating them as purely scores. I have, for individual one, it would be 4/16, but for the last individual, now the score is going to be 9/16 because I have used this G square function to transform and make it into a different deprivation matrix called the real deprivation matrix. We are again going to, aggregate all of this and divide it by the number of individuals here. So it looks very much like that M naught will be a special case where this was a linear transformation, right? But here now you're asking it to be an increasing and convex function rather than a linear transformation. And you can think of more fancier ways in which you can use any other function for these. And the authors go into talking about the details on what are some of the properties that they do, but sort of highlighting in for you in this short discussion, we are looking at, again, distributional changes, and the index is going to be now sensitive. Remember, for Alkire-Foster, you are just adding those. Now you are taking a transformation which is convex. So you're implying different weights, the more deprivations you have. You're looking at concentration of deprivations. There is an interesting property which we discuss, what we call as the deprivation decreasing switch. And this is borrowed from the intuition which Stiglitz had in his report of 2009. I'm going to sort of verbatim read it and let you sort of reflect on that property, that you're looking at the sum or the harm caused by two different dimensional deprivations which are occurring simultaneously. So you're looking at whether there were simultaneous deprivations, and those should be weighted more or should be greater than if those happened one at a time. So you have one deprivation and then you had the other deprivation. So in some way, it's capturing that intensity or that overlap that your measure should reflect that, which is not reflected in the Alkire-Foster measure when I'm looking at this deprivation decreasing switch. We do have empirical illustrations on these alternative measures as well as the Alkire-Foster measures, and we do show that the trends are similar between those, but of course the magnitudes are going to be different depending on the weighing schemes. So I'm going to sort of come to the fourth section, the last section of the presentation. I think we should, we have about 10 minutes, right? I'm looking at the card. Okay, we are good on time, and I should be able to finish that in the next 10 minutes. Looking at empirical literature in the US on multidimensional poverty. Interestingly, the US was pretty late on looking at these measures in terms of estimating them. The UN measure started in 2010, if you recall, and they have estimates for about 110 developing countries. US was late to join the party. As Dr. Chaudhary mentioned, I'm a research affiliate with the National Poverty Center at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I had a co-author there, and we started really developing a measure which was suitable for the US context. Bob Halfman and I worked on those And we had our first paper come out, first paper in the sense, first estimates for the US, which were looking over time. And we looked at the Great Recession and how multidimensional poverty was tracking compared to the income poverty level. In the US, we have two large data sets. The American Community Survey is something which most of us have used in this field, and that gives you much more detailed information on dimensions other than income. It's one of the largest data surveys conducted by the US Census Bureau. Annually, you have about 3 million or so individuals into that data set. So you get the annual sample. They also have a much larger round, which happens every 5 years. So if you're looking at every 5 years, the data is in fact larger. The other data set, which some of you may be aware, is called the Correct Population Survey, or the CPS, also done by the US Census Bureau. That is looking more into details on income indicators, and that is sort of their official data source to measure income poverty in the US, which is actually, I should say, consumption poverty, not income poverty, but single dimensional consumption poverty in the US. We have a bunch of papers starting with that 2017, and I have just given you the table to see what are the different time frameworks that these covered. I'm going to focus on the last one, which gives you a much broader picture. That's sort of looking at a decade-long multidimensional poverty in the US, and it's most comprehensive compared to the previous ones. So looking at indicators and thresholds in the US, we look at the Stiglitz report and borrow from the Stiglitz report some of the parts where he focuses on standard of living in developed countries. We look at health, education, housing costs, and something on English fluency and number of persons. So if you notice, we are moving away from the UN measure, moving for standard of living. For instance, we look at severe housing burden, which is an important dimension in the US, where you're looking at monthly owner costs or gross rent in excess of 50% of your household income. And that's the threshold used by the National Agency for Housing and Development. We find for the last decade or so, about 12% of people were severely housing burdened. So this is a different measure than what you would see in the UN or the World Bank one. One of the other ones which comes very often is the high school completion rates in the US, unfortunately, are pretty high. About 10% of the population was not completing their high school. The one which you would know from some of the Affordable Care Act literature is health insurance or having access to health insurance. And that's about 17%. So some of these are really the bolder ones I've shown you are the ones where you see just by the dashboard that these are going to be much larger. Looking at disabilities, we don't have much information on health, unfortunately, in either the CPS or the ACS in the US. The EU Silk data really does a good job with looking at health parts, looking at even mental health dimensions. And we don't have much on housing quality. So what we do is we look at overcrowding, which is defined in the US as having more than one occupant per room, and we get an estimate of how many people are living into those. If you look at the dashboard, that gives you a picture, as I said, the three large indicators where we have a greater incidence is looking at no health insurance, and that sort of was pretty high. Almost 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 Americans did not have health insurance before we had the Obama Health Care Act passed in 2014. And then that incidence really drops to about somewhere between 12 and 14%. Housing costs have been pretty high, especially this was important when we were looking at the recession of 2010-2011, and they have stayed high and are now slowly declining. We stopped here before the pandemic, and we have separate studies for the COVID pandemic because things got very different during the pandemic. We did not want those compared to the previous years, but we have new papers coming on those ones. High school completion rate over time has steadily declined. And then the lower three are crowded housing, disabilities, and anyone in the household, if you don't have any single person who's able to speak English or is aware or able to communicate, that's the lack of English fluency. If you look at trends in poverty measures, here I would focus on the head count ratio. So just look at the head count ratio from that MPI. I'm not giving you the entire MPI, but looking at what is the incidence. We identify about 13% of the US population as multidimensional poor. What does that mean? We are looking at these 6 indicators and counting any individual who has at least 2 out of those 6 deprivations as poor. So it's coming very similar to the UN threshold of about 30 or 33%. That we are looking at. If you have 2 or more deprivations, you are going to get identified as multidimensional poor. You do see in the last 2 rows, I've given you the official income. Sorry, I keep on saying income. Official poverty measure in the US, which is income based, but looking more into consumption baskets, and the supplemental poverty measure that is also published by the Census Bureau. One big difference between the official and the supplemental poverty measure is the supplemental poverty measure is a bit more nuanced. It adjusts your income levels to taxes and subsidies. So some of the welfare programs like child tax credit will be included in the supplemental poverty measure and not really into the official poverty measure. The numbers are slightly hard to follow over the years. We looked at the averages, but if we look at the trends, you will notice that the official poverty measure is this blue line, which was pretty stagnant during, it increased during the recession. In the short-term post-recovery period, we did not see any decline in that official poverty measure, and then there was decline after 2014. What we see against this is the multidimensional measure. If you compare the blue and the green, multidimensional poverty also peaked like the income measures, but then it shows quick recovery during the short-term period following the recession, and it has declined or continued to decline much more or much faster than the official measure. The supplemental poverty measure comes slightly closer to the multidimensional poverty measures, especially during the recession, but they too tend to decline pretty slowly in the post-recession or recovery period. If I look at some of the dimensions, and this is a question I often get when I have my talks on why should we really bother to look at 6 different dimensions if income can really capture those, right? If income is a way in which these are going to be highly correlated to a lack of income, then we can just rely on income poverty measures. And that's why we want to look at a correlation with income of these different deprivations. I've highlighted some of the larger ones, and then the other ones are pretty smaller. So if I'm looking at income poverty and I'm looking at health insurance, this is the correlation coefficient that I'm looking at of 0.29. So not pretty high. I'm looking at high school completion about 0.31. The largest that we get with income poverty is the housing burden. And that is sort of expected because the definition is your housing cost should be 50% more of your income measure. So your income is getting included into that housing burden. But otherwise, the correlations are pretty low, and that is one of the reasons we want to look at non-income measures to identify these multidimensional poor. If I'm looking at, I'm giving you sort of again a big picture of these. So I'm averaging out here the trends, but looking at say one particular year. I'm showing you this figure for 2011, which was the peak of that Great Recession. At the peak level, we had income poverty was about 14%, if you remember from the official poverty measures. We saw that multidimensional poverty was also identifying a similar incidence. About 15% of Americans we identified by our measure as multidimensional poor. The census estimates were about 14% income poor. When we looked at the overlap between these two, that how many of the income poors were actually included in our measure, we see the overlap even at the height of the recession was not much large. We see about 6% of income poor were also multidimensional poor. Now, unlike the World Bank's measure, our measure does not really include income as such. It is included indirectly in that housing burden. So what we are seeing is that we really don't have a big overlap. So that is one of the reasons you want to talk when you're talking to policymakers, why people should care about multidimensional poor, that you are identifying a population subset which is not identifying by the income thresholds, which is not really getting the support in terms of social welfare programs which are attached to these income thresholds. Yet they are suffering from other dimensional deprivations. And if I go into the details of these, I just showed you this overlap, but we can go by what is your income bracket. And if I see this 100 to 200%, so if your household's income is slightly above the poverty threshold, it's between 100 and 200% of the poverty threshold. So you're slightly above that, you're not income poor. Then the average MPI in that, the average incidence was 25% of individuals in that bracket were identified as multidimensional poor. So we really make a strong case when we are presenting this work to folks in Washington, D.C., that this is where you want to focus your efforts on, are the people who are not income poor, but they're not very rich. If I go into 200 to 500%, I get about 7%. If I have incomes which are 500 times the income threshold, which would be high incomes, and people may be making the case here that people by choice are living into an overcrowded house or an extra large or extra expensive house, how come you would count those as deprived? That's our answer, that those would be some of the individual choices, and people may have those large incomes, but about 1% or so who have very high incomes are getting counted as multidimensional poor. So the index is actually, the estimates are actually capturing the incidence in terms of where you want to focus your policies. I mentioned the Alkire-Foster index. That's the one where you had K taking different values, right? What is that second step? In the US, if I look at anyone who's deprived in at least one indicators, that's the index that the Dhongde Patnaik Shub measure had. That's the union approach, right? If you're deprived in any one, then we get about 37% over the decade. This is average over the decade. If I'm looking at two or at least two, so this is two or more, you get about 13%. In the US, things start dropping off very quickly. If you tend towards that intersection approach, you would see that you're not getting anything meaningful if I use the intersection approach, right? That there is hardly any population which is deprived in all six. If I have at least five or more, then I have about 0.1% of population. So when you are an empirical scholar and want to have a measure which is much more relevant, you do want to see where you want to choose that K as your threshold, and whether it's going to make any difference between the incidence of poverty. We do a lot of typical empirical papers which are robust, will give you different weights attached, and I won't walk you through all of these right now, but you can assign different weights. You can see how the measure is sensitive to different weights. We here in the picture removed weights on each one of the indicators to see how sensitive they were for those measures. And of course, when we remove the weight on health insurance, our poverty estimates really drop much more than on some of the others. We do statewide distribution. Like many countries, US is very diverse in terms of its standard of livings. One of the limitations of the census income poverty measure is that it is not changing by states, and that is one of the drawbacks of the income poverty measure, is it's using the same poverty threshold even if you're living in, say, South Dakota versus in California. You are having the same threshold applied. And that's why there is now much interest in how standard of living is different for different states. And in our paper, we do use some of the neighborhood indices. We add those to the 6 dimensions that I showed you, looking at pollution, looking at water quality in the neighborhoods where we have data. And we do see that it's the West and the South which has much higher incidence in the US, and almost the shading is gradual, that you have some kind of medium multidimensional poverty here and much lower in the northern or the Midwest part. New York is, of course, something where multidimensional poverty was much higher. Especially given the recession. We can, of course, look at the Alkire-Foster measures and do the subgroup decomposition by different population groups. What I have done here is looking more at the incidence rather than the adjusted head count ratio. And interestingly, I've just highlighted a few things for you to the US. It's the young adults that we see in the last decade, which had some of the higher incidence of poverty. Looking at these 6 indicators, we found that about 14 to 15% of young adults between ages 18 to 25 and 25 to 35 were having much higher incidence of multidimensional poverty. By race, it was more largely Hispanic population as well as Asian population in the US, which had much larger population identified as multidimensional poor. You have by gender, you can look at marital status. Again, if you're aware of the US poverty literature, it's usually the single-headed households rather than married households which have larger poverty levels. And we see that male-headed or single male-headed or single female-headed households had about 20%, which is again pretty high. And then we go by nativity. This is census, so it's not looking at legal, illegal immigrants and so on. It's just going by native born versus foreign born. So take that into account. And of course, foreign born population had much more and significantly higher incidence than the native born. So to summarize, we looked in the empirical part, looked at last 12 years and found about 13% of the working adult population. I forgot to mention that that we look at the working adult population because our indicators are suitable for that population. It's 18 years old all the way till 65 years old. We remove the retired population as well as the children. We saw that during the recession, poverty peaked to almost 15 to 16%, but then it quickly recovered in the following years. In 2019, and that's the last year in our empirical studies, it was about 10% in the US. And that you can sort of compare about right now, we are somewhere about 8% if I remember the 2025 figures in our measure. Compared to 17% what you see globally in the UN MPI. But much more significant was the very small overlap between the income poor and the multidimensional poor, that we have about 5 to 6% of population falling in both those categories. We went over the subgroups. In the US, the dimensions which were most important in terms of policies where you want to target was the health insurance, and we showed that the ACA or the Affordable Care Act was really influential in pulling down some of these measures. The housing costs have been in some way, there are policies now in place which have addressed some of those. Education continues to be something which the US needs to work compared to other developed countries where we fall behind Japan and other Asian countries. I'm going to sort of conclude on a quote which I found very interesting by Rebecca Blank. She was at the head of the National Poverty Center and now is I think the Vice Chancellor at Wisconsin-Madison, that poverty is an inherently vague concept, which we saw right in the last hour or so. It's very tricky even to go by single dimensions, and things get very quickly complicated once you have more than one dimension. And developing a poverty measure requires a number of relatively arbitrary assumptions, though that's even if they are arbitrary assumptions, it's an important exercise. That's where I want to sort of emphasize that because we are making some assumptions doesn't mean the exercise itself is not of use. It sheds different lights, and you can always show different ways in which you can capture the standard of living by choosing different indicators, choosing different thresholds, choosing different weights to see a bigger or broader picture. So the bottom line would be not to get fixated with one particular estimate, but have a broader range in your mind when you're thinking about how to address some of these concerns in terms of policy. And with that, I'll conclude my presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much uh, for your excellent and nice presentation. And the more importantly, it is very clear, and you have engaged both um, empirical data and also some of our sharpens our normative understandings, especially for US economy and poverty measurement. This is a vivid example of a clear understanding, and there is a comparative analysis between. I haven't found this earlier, that that UN based lens and World Bank based lens. So these are different things, though they have some overlappings on it. So I think for 5 to 7 minutes you can take rest, because there is a long time you have spoken on it. We are getting prepared to the next Q&A session, and Professor Patnaik sir, would you like to say something on her presentation?
Actually, I don't have any very specific question. I have a general sort of comment, which you may treat as a question. I was thinking all these different measures that we are talking about, there was an alternative suggestion, mainly advocated by Martin Ravalian. He was suggesting, given that aggregation is causing a huge amount of problem with an immense amount of value judgment with respect to different things, he was suggesting, why don't we adopt a dashboard approach so that we don't try to aggregate at all. We talk about income poverty, which has been dominant for a long time, even now, and then supplement it by a lot of separate rankings in terms of housing alone, in terms of health alone, because as we go on aggregating over these different sort of dimensions, we are facing both analytical problems. Our theoretical basis is pretty weak, and our empirical basis is becoming more and more weak, and it is becoming extremely confusing for the policymaker. So if we want to help the policymaker, which I believe is a major objective of this sort of exercise, what would you think about Martin Ravalian's suggestion? Let's just take a dashboard approach, so that we just put down the columns. And if you want to talk about deprivation, etc., with respect to that column, we know it is not very satisfactory, because it is ignoring all the interaction between the different achievements. But for the policymaker, what do they make out of our complicated aggregations? Can they understand anything of it at all?
Thank you.
Are we confusing them more than we are clarifying their understanding?
Thank you. It's okay, right? I take one question, answer, and then take the other questions, right?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, sure.
Just trying to see what's the process. Well, we have a skeptic in the audience whom I have not been able to convince that why these measures are important. And that's always a good point. And yes, Ravalian has written about this, as Prashanta just mentioned, that why not just look at the dashboard, right? My argument is the other way around. Why why just look at the dashboard, right? You have to give the dashboard. So when you are looking at empirical estimates of multidimensional poverty, you want to show the policymakers, and as I showed in that slide, you want to, let me sort of use it as my basis. It's much easier to talk. Okay. Are you able, let me go back. Yeah. So if we go to this is what Trevelyan is looking for, is a dashboard, right? And the question is, we can have this in addition to income and then just say, okay, in the US, it's health insurance, let's just fix health insurance. No harm if that is the objective where you want to look at these dimensions separately. I do believe that multidimensional poverty measures, whatever aggregation rule you want to do, and you're absolutely right that things get complicated. You have to walk them through how we are aggregating and what is the average that we are taking. But once we get through that part, you do get some other information which is important. And one of the things which we did not know till we actually calculated that part was this one, that how many of the US or the Americans are facing overlapping deprivations. Now, would you care about that? Well, depends on what type of policy you're looking at. But if you do care about someone not having deprivations, and I can take very specific, here I'm giving you an example with at least two, but I can be very specific that you don't have health insurance and you are a high school dropout. That is going to really limit your access to health, and that is going to really substantially lower your standard of living, because now you're a high school dropout and you don't have any health insurance. I can look at housing costs as well as health insurance, or housing costs and the overlap of housing costs with high school education, and so on, right? So you are somewhere not getting in that dashboard that overlap, which is the main feature of multidimensional measure. Is you want to see, and we ourselves in our property emphasize that, right? That it is not really just what deprivation you have in each of these indices, that when I look at these averages, I do have an idea of what is the average looking like, that 10% of population doesn't have education and 16% don't have health insurance. But what I'm more interested in is sometimes how people's quality of life is getting affected when they have say more than three. And in the US, really that is really a small group of people. We come to know only when we look at a multidimensional poverty estimate here, that look, not many people or not many Americans have three or more deprivations. If you broadly have those six, I mean, you need to believe in those six and you need to believe in the measure, but that is not somewhere which is concerning. So when I'm talking to a policymaker, where I'm trying to say, why is this important? I'm going to say, let's focus on this group of at least two. You already know at least one by the column approach. You can choose any dimensions and you can see what is the deprivation in each one of those. But somewhere, if you want to have an approach where you are looking at overlaps and whether those affect your quality of life, which I believe they do, then you do want to be specific. You can be general. Here it's showing any of the two of the six. But you can be more specific in terms of, I want to see the overlap between these two specific indicators. And that will help the policy, because that is where you're identifying, we saw in terms of US, that many of the individuals were making more than the poverty threshold income. So these were the people who had incomes above the threshold but had deprivations. Now, do I just want to see their dashboard? Perhaps not. I do want to see that between that 100 and 200 bracket level, income bracket, how many of those had two deprivations in this 25% of that population? How many of those had three deprivations? Or which were the three deprivations? We can go more into details on that once you have a multidimensional poverty estimate.
All right.
Okay, Ronnie Bhai and Professor Dhongde, we have a couple other questions, a couple other raised hands from the audience. Whenever we are ready, we can take those.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah,
Yes. Alex
Go ahead. I don't need
Al-
a 10.
Alex.
Hi.
Alex is Alex is from Germany. He is just doing his PhD. He will just start his PhD, and I think this presentation will help him to figure him out which method he will choose. So, Alex, go ahead.
Yeah, very much. I mean, thank you for the presentation. It helps a lot because, I mean, we all have to recognize that something needs to be measured. How we measure and what we measure is just a really difficult question. So it was useful to get these insights. My questions, I've got three, I think, broadly, that they're all sort of interconnected. And I think the first is just that obviously, I think obviously, none of these indicators are discrete, and that, you know, if you've got better healthcare, you're going to have better education, and if you have better education, you might have better housing. And so having these sort of separate indicators, to what extent do you kind of trying to figure out, well, actually, we need to disentangle these in order to get the data we want to. And just like part of that to me, and maybe this is kind of, in my mind, it's somewhat similar of an issue, but it's the second question, which is, to what extent then can your data or your methodology in the US also apply to other countries? Because we want to be able to compare poverty across countries. Because at the very least, it seems that it's not just that different cultures might value different ones of those indicators differently, but you might value them differently at different times. So if you just had a child, you might be willing to forego your own personal health and food so that they can, you know, their education's better. And so in that sense, what does it tell us about their poverty as opposed to the value that they attach to the indicators? And then my third question is, and this is kind of where my own personal interest is at the moment, is the emergence of a happiness index that kind of goes around and says, okay, countries are ranked on happiness. We only need to measure subjective well-being. And the whole point of all these indicators is that people live more meaningful, happy, subjectively well-being lives. Do you think that's where we're going and a more useful sort of way of thinking about it? Those are my only questions.
Thank you so much. Great questions and qualifying. I may not have answers to all of these, but happy to discuss some of these. You make some very interesting points, and I am absolutely on board with you that these measures are something which we choose from. How do we make it more cross-country, right? Comparable across countries. We base our choice on the Stiglitz-Fitosi report, where he lays down, I think, all of these dimensions, and I think there were two more. One is political voice, which is important, and then there is something called civil participation, which is whether you are participating in civil societies. And those are something which he mentions for developed countries, and sort of they have the whole report on why they are identifying some of those dimensions. So you do need something like an anchor, right? I have used this report to sort of say, okay, let's take the subset of developed countries and have some uniformity in terms of the dimensions that you are going to use, and then you are able to compare the poverty measures. Definitely, it's very hard once you go to each country and see what type of data is available. As I mentioned, the EU, and knowing that you're from Germany, you would have much more accessible data and much more detailed data on some of these dimensions compared to the US. We have looked at Canada, we have looked at US, EU, as well as Australia and Japan. And though they are not exactly comparable, you can sort of see what are the incidences. And as you may have predicted, US does not do very well on many of the indicators compared to the other developed countries, right? One of them is education. So it's useful to have these, even when I said that they can be specific to a country, that we are able to compare them across countries. What are the values attached? And that sort of linking to your first question, is that true that depending on the age that you mentioned young adults that we identify, and they may have very different trade-offs versus someone who's close to retiring at the age of 60, and they may have different trade-offs. How are we going to capture those? This is the framework that we show because US did not have any national level statistics, right? And that was an attempt to provide for the last 10 years what are the poverty estimates for the US. But people don't have to stop here. You can have very specific groups and look at poverty measures for those groups. You can focus on the young adults. You can use the literature, and you just mentioned the literature on subjective poverty measures. And that's a very helpful literature because it informs you what are the things that people are thinking when they're comparing themselves with others, right? It's a very relative measure in that way. And you can use some of those indicators to develop a very different poverty index for different age groups. We have a paper where we don't use any of these, but it's looking at the elderly in the US and what is their multidimensional well-being. And we move away from each one of those because there are policies where all the elderly are either covered by some sort of health insurance. So this really doesn't make a matter to that. So definitely, I mean, the measures are very much changeable in some way, right? Adaptable to what you want to address in terms of a policy question. Going back to Prashanta's previous question also, I mean, people may think we are losing too much information with 6 indicators. We don't have to use all 6 indicators, right? Your multidimensional poverty can be income poverty and something else, where you are seeing the overlap of income and one or two other dimensions. And that, if that is something the policymakers are looking for, then that is the way to address or give them that information. Lastly, you mentioned about happiness index, and this really always comes up, and I do want to dig deeper into that literature to see how that is sort of tracking with multidimensional poverty measures, right? We do have some estimates right now looking at the UNMPI and the Global Happiness Index, where people are seeing some similarities in terms of trends into that, but of course they are capturing very different parts. So happiness index is again another way in which you want to look at standard of living. Multidimensional poverty may be a different way, income poverty may be a different way. And what I believe is you want to have, if you want to have a comprehensive picture, not focus on the tree, but the forest, you do want to take into account all of those different estimates when you are giving or advising policymakers about how to intervene and improve the standard of living.
Right. Great. Right. So we have another question. Mahmoodul Kareem. Please unmute and go ahead. Mr. Mahmoodul Kareem.
Am I audible?
Yes, yes. Yes, go ahead.
I think you have given the answers to my question in the last slide. And you have also highlighted some issues answering Alex, but still I'm going to throw my question. Suppose you are in between poverty measurement exercise. You are measuring my poverty state. So suppose I don't want to answer the true state of things. Suppose I provide fabricated data just to hide the true nature of things. Does that happen at all? In your experience, have you felt or seen such phenomena? That's question one. Question two comes from the idea that, as you were referring, that access to different infrastructure becomes irrelevant to some developed countries, like access to electricity, clean water, potable water. So that gives me a feeling of that poverty is becoming non-universal or something of, we get a version of poverty in a different countries. So the poverty in Bangladesh is not equal to poverty of United States, or idea of poverty is different in Bangladesh. The idea of poverty is totally different from presentation. So, do you think my questions are valid? What's your take on these questions? I would love.
I think we lost the second
Yeah.
question from Mr. Karim. That was
Thanks
the
so much.
audio. Yeah.
I think Mohammed, as pointed out, I think I caught some parts of it, but I'll try to address for sure your two questions. Fabricated responses, very much important. One way to get around that is use something which is nationally representative data sources. So remember the ACS or the CPS that we use in the US are not really poverty measuring surveys. Those are US Census surveys looking at different sources of incomes and your savings and bank accounts and so on. The ACS is also a community survey which is looking at all these different questions. Because you're using something which is done by the Census Bureau, you are able to use their response rates and see those would be typically better than surveys done at a local level. Is there a measurement bias there involved? Sure. Always for income surveys, we know that there is a measurement error. People do tend to report their incomes in some brackets, hide maybe their educational levels and so on. The question we also get when we are talking about multidimensional poverty measures is what if people, these are not really deprivations, right? In developed countries, people may be making a choice of living in a very expensive house. And would you consider them as deprived in terms of severe housing burden? Or what about the overcrowding, that there are racial and ethnic groups where you have large joint families and people are living in some of those houses? Are those really relevant parts, or are they fabricated ones? I think one part for us to see is that if we go into details and see that maybe the Asian population is coming up a lot here, we can then look at a different measure, or we can qualify that if I reduce the weight on this particular index, what is going to be the poverty measure in that particular racial or ethnic group. In terms of people making choices that they would like to have, I think this sort of addresses that if you are pretty well to do in terms of your income and are still getting counted as multidimensional poor, that false identification are chances that we have about 1% of the population which has much high income and is still seeing deprivations in at least two dimensions. If this number is larger, then you do want to take a look at what are the indicators that you are choosing. But if this number is not very large, that is one way to decide that whether you're capturing voluntary choices of people or not. Just looking at their deprivation in terms of income and where they fall in that income bracket. In terms of context dependent, whether poverty is a global notion or not, again, that will depend. You have something like the UN MPI or the World Banks where you can make comparisons using their measures across 100 plus developing countries. And that's great because that's where you want to have a comparative measure. If you are not interested in that, and if you want to have a measure very specific to Bangladesh, for instance, you want to look at indicators which are suitable to that country and are important where the policy debate is happening. For us, including housing costs was important because that's where US policy was focused, especially with the housing bubble that was burst during that recession. That housing costs were something where we knew that policymakers are paying attention. Healthcare access was another one where there was a major policy intervention in 2014. So some of those may not be really globally consistent or even relevant, but they may nevertheless be important if you're looking at that particular country. So a poverty measure doesn't have to be global or national. It can be even local and very specific to a particular question, to a particular group, to a particular population subgroup. I think we are
Yes.
almost there, but I see one more hand and I can take one more
Yes.
question.
Yes. Yes. Su Ming Ku. Yes.
Thank you, Professor Dhongde, for an excellent presentation. And I want to go back to exactly to the slide, the puzzle, because it's a very difficult finding to communicate if Professor Patnaik is, to be heeded that you're trying to make you're trying to talk to policymakers and make an impact on policymaking. And this very puzzling Venn diagram that you have of the multidimensionally poor are by and large not the same group as the income poor. So this is a very simple question, is how do you tell the story? What is this real story about? And possibly is this an artifact of the threshold of income poverty itself? Is it simply that the threshold for defining who is income poor is simply too low? Or is it something else? And I think so this is the first part of the question is the simple one. The second part, unfortunately, because I'm a sociologist, is I'm incapable of asking a simple question. And this is really, I'm thinking a lot more about the temporality in which our measurement resides. And the fact that we, maybe also this speaks to Alex's question about well-being measurement and subjective measurement and happiness and so on, and where are we going with this, is that we seem to be, our development trajectories are not going in a straight line. We're somehow in an intertemporal. Our social clock of progress seems to be not working. We are going backwards or not really forwards, something like that. So I'm just thinking about what measurement is in the situation where our assumptions about realization-focused comparisons, about progress, are not going in the right direction, you could say, or the assumed direction, which is a forwards direction. And I'm thinking a lot about Professor Fukuda Par's old paper when she reflected at the end of MDGs about how we have new narratives and new instruments, new measurements, but we don't have new policies. And whether we have made some kind of Faustian bargain where we try to simplify things for the policymakers and to get people on board with our program to reduce multidimensional poverty or reduce poverty. That's a really good impact, very good aim. But we gave up the real question of development, which was about national transformation and the possibility that countries could have different policies which would be contextually defined. So yeah, that's the kind of broader question that I have, is like, what is the trap that we get into when we try to simplify things? And the first little bit of question was really, is the simplification just really about, is this complicated question really about having just a far too low threshold to define who is really poor by income means?
Thank you so much. Great questions. I'm so glad you mentioned Fukuda. I have met at some of the UNU wider conferences. So I really appreciate you citing her work. I don't have an answer to your second question, right? I guess it was more commentary, so I shouldn't even attempt to answer that. Point well taken. It's always anything to do. I'm a economist of measurement, right? So anytime I'm measuring something, that is something that you have to deal with. That are we getting into the trap of just figuring out fancier and fancier mathematical contraptions to measure something which is so obvious for the non-academicians, and we are just publishing papers after papers on something like a holy trail of the correct poverty measure and so on. So well taken points on that. I think what you mentioned here is very much true in terms of US income poverty, that there is a big discussion, well, not in which is not very current, has been happening for the last 2 decades or so, about changing the income poverty threshold in the US. And the official poverty measure, as I mentioned, has many drawbacks. One of them is it's looking at the income notion without taking into account some of the taxes and subsidies and benefits that are received. It's not adjusting for differences in standard of living across regions, right? Something where North New York and California and Texas will have the same thresholds. So there has been a debate about changing that official poverty measure, and that's where the supplemental poverty measure came into picture, and census itself started looking at both. The official poverty measure is almost like the elephant. No one wants to touch that measure anymore because it's so much entrenched in many of our welfare programs. It's almost politically impossible to make any changes into that official poverty measure. So that may not change. And that's why these alternative supplemental poverty measures and consumption poverty measures, which one of my colleagues BLS is working on. So they have other measures and they are trying to capture or at least get a more comprehensive thresholds of income. What you see here is, I would in fact say, sort of a solution to the puzzle rather than the puzzle itself. That when I'm looking at this smaller overlap between the income poor and the multidimensional poor, that's what prompts me to go into this part. And I gave you only 3 or 4 of those categories. You can go into more refined categories if you have households identifying themselves into those categories. Is that we then thought, like, who are the multidimensional poor that we are identifying, which are not captured by the income poor? And those were the ones who were just above that double of whatever is the threshold for that family, making money between that 100 and 200% ratio. And we did see as we go above, there is a big drop, right? Between 200 and 500, you're seeing 7%, and above that, it's 1%. So I think this is where we would like to tell policymakers to focus their attention in terms of non-income deprivations. That these were the people who had some basic income levels. As you mentioned, those were really basic for the US standard of living, that these may be the households who had a severe housing burden, who had low paying jobs because they did not have uh, good education, or they were not having healthcare access, and so on. So that is something where, coming back to Krishanta's previous question, is that rather than that dashboard, you want to see how many of them are facing these multiple dimensions, not just one deprivation, multiple dimensions. In terms of are we talking about a trap in itself? I think the uh, part which you mentioned in your question is going to be helpful for us as academicians to keep in mind, is that what is sort of the goal where you are taking your research, right? The goal can be, and it's not a bad goal if you are looking into more and more axiomatic properties and getting a very strong index which is axiomatically satisfying and preserving many parts. the other goal may be that you want to go by Martin Revelion's approach and just look at the columns, right? The columns approach and just look at what is the dashboard. So it depends on where you are on that spectrum and what type of information you want to give. Not all would like to think of their research as informing policy. Some of us do, some of us don't. So it really comes to that part. I think the success of that Alkire-Foster index was somewhere that it straddled both of these parts, that it was easier to adopt, right? It was much easier to communicate. I have measured using this data, tried different indices. It's much harder to interpret those when I'm talking to a more broader audience. And I have realized that the Alkire-Foster index, even the adjusted headcount index, today we just focused on headcount, but those are much more intuitive. And the good part is they do satisfy some of the axiomatic properties, right? So that's where countries started, or national statistical offices started adopting those indices, that they made some sense in terms of relevance. That they were not some of these exotic mathematical functions, that they also had a conceptual background in terms of the FGT indices, which are much more prevalent in the literature and people know about them, the average poverty gap, the squared poverty gap, and they have the parallels there. So once in a while, you do come across something where you think that, okay, we have made progress. I would rather put a positive spin on your second question, saying that we may not have really regressed, but we are making step-by-step progress towards that part where you are not getting too much entangled into these discussions, but really are thinking about the relevance of how we can bring some information in terms of relevance to the society and its progress.
No, absolutely. I don't. I'm not adopting, plumping for Ravelion's approach. In fact, I see that the multidimensional approach also has a very valuable function to bring to the fore some sideways questions. So when I looked at the characteristics that you presented of the multidimensional poor, the first was, simply, well, this income poverty thing. Maybe they're just drawing the line far too low. And that is why there are two bubbles and not just one. But then the other thing that, immediately came to mind is that, was Professor Jay Drydeck's lecture one of the years at the HDCA conference, where he talked about oppression. And it seemed that, the characteristics that you highlighted of the multidimensionally poor, which were that they were more likely to be foreign born, they were Hispanic, they were Asian, and they were Black, seemed to point to something else, which wasn't in any of the other wasn't in any of the case, but it was certainly something that I could see sideways from having the multidimensional. And I wasn't really talking about progression and regression just to sort of say, oh, we shouldn't bother doing this. I think really it's that we shouldn't assume that progression is taking place, and that we can take an intertemporal, evaluative, and critical mindset where we can think about looking at different points of time. And I think that's because we are at a point of time now today where the SDGs are going to expire soon. And we will be in a similar position, again, to that position that Professor Fukuda Parr was when she wrote that evaluation of what had happened with the MDGs, which reflected on the power of the MDGs as an important social and policy tool, but how they had sold their soul to a Faustian bargain. So we could also be on the road to doing that again if we didn't have the wisdom of intertemporal evaluation.
True. Well said. You're very eloquent.
Right. One more. Can I take one more question? It's written. Mr. Mustafa, who wrote, when we consider the indicator for education threshold as not having received at least high school diploma, how we can justify it as an indicator for Bangladesh? How can we adapt it, keeping it comparable? What kind of adaptation is possible?
Thank you.
Because the question is not
Keep
clear.
track of the chat questions. Sorry. I think it will depend. I think Bangladesh has data on the number of years of education, right? So one way to translate this would be to look at an equivalent number of years of education in Bangladesh, which will mean what does it take 12 years to finish high school, 10 years to finish high school in that context, and then you can adjust it accordingly. High school education is something which is kind of a pretty low bar for the US. We could have gone to at least 2 years of college education, or we could have even moved further up, looking at other countries' indicators as having some college education or not. The reason we took high school graduation as one of the indicators was, as you saw, that there is almost 10% or 9 to 10% now of population which is not high school graduates. And we thought that that is a sizable population that we can keep the threshold there. In other sections of the paper, we do reduce it even to less than high school, where we say 5 to 7 years of education, which would mean middle school for the US. Again, for Bangladesh's case, I'm seeing the person asking the question is looking to adapt this. This will depend on whether you want to look at, say, just primary education, right? Basic literacy. Or do you want to look at something much more in terms of at least junior college, completing junior college, and so on? That would be the case.
Right, right. So thank you. So Professor Maurice, would you like to say something? Please unmute and yes. Now
No,
you are
well,
on.
in fact, in the comments, I had all the answers to my questions. My main concern is about the choice of thresholds, indicators, weights. Who are making the choices? Is it the expert? Is it the policymakers, the politicians? Who are they?
Very fundamental.
No, Dr. Morris, you're absolutely right. And people do feel bogged down, right? That how are we making all these choices? And we started with very basic ones. What indicators should we use? What dimensions are health, education, standard of living the right dimensions? Should we have something like political voice or civil participation, and so on? We go to indicators, we have more choices to face. We talked about different techniques which people have used. Some of them have used the literature's basis. Some of them have used very statistical measures like principal component analysis. Some of them have used fancier ones in terms of latent variable regressions to calculate these. We have next is the thresholds, right? And that those choices don't go away in terms of what should be the thresholds, what should be the weights attached, what should be the aggregation function that we should use. But I don't think having these questions should be a disincentive for young researchers to come to this topic. In fact, that makes the topic even more challenging, right? That you have all of these questions, and you have all of these questions. You may never find what would be one correct indicator. And that's where I think my focus has been. That you don't have to say this is the winner and this is the only way that I'm going to measure a multidimensional poverty in any particular context, any time framework, any country, any population subgroup. You have to make these choices. You have to defend them in some way. You have to also acknowledge the limitations of those choices. Why focus on these 6 indicators and why not others? Some of them may have practical reasons that we just don't have data. We would like to have much more data in the US on health. I didn't touch anything about health because at the census level, we don't collect data on health. It's done by the CDC, but when the CDC does the health service, they don't ask about housing and they don't ask about education and so on. So you have some of the practical constraints. So when you are making these choices, making choices should not be a deterrent to just take that leap, make those choices, and give something useful in terms of those parameters, right? You can always qualify that, look, these are the choices on which this study is based, and these are the limitations because of the practical nature of data and so on. But not making that leap sort of makes us just stand on the banks and not jump into that water, those waters in terms of measurement. And it can be measurement of well-being, deprivation, income, standard of livings. We talked about happiness and so on, that it would be impossible then to measure anything meaningful if we are scared to make those choices.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So our professor convener, Professor Prashanta Patnaik, sir.
Well, I have thoroughly enjoyed the lecture. It's a wonderful lecture, solving a huge area, a lot of detailed sort of specific questions have been discussed. And I would like to thank Shatakshee again. And I would like to mention, he mentioned about my supervising a dissertation. In the process of supervising a dissertation, I learned at least as much from her as she learned from me. Thank you.
Always nice to see you here, and thank you so much to all other participants. I know this may not have been the ideal time for you to join. It's a weekend study circle. I'm energized by the level of engagement and participation each one of you had, and appreciated all the questions and feedback that you gave. Thank you, Dr. Chaudhary.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Shatakshee. Namaskar, and with this, we will conclude today's session, and our next two session is on next Saturday. The speaker is Professor Maurice Saleh, and then after that, on 20th December, Professor Kaushik Basu will speak. So there are lot more exciting sessions coming up. So so we'll catch up soon. So take care till then. Namaskar and goodbye. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.